close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're walking through the marble corridors of ancient Rome, the greatest empire the world has ever known. You hear the echo of sandals against stone, smell the incense burning in nearby temples, feel the Mediterranean sun warming your skin. Rome, city of philosophers, engineers, conquerors. But now, follow me down this particular corridor. Do you hear that sound? Running water, voices echoing off tile, laughter even. We're approaching something the history books gloss over. Something your teachers conveniently forgot to mention when they talked about Roman baths and aqueducts. We're about to enter a Roman public toilet, and I promise you, nothing in your modern experience has prepared you for what happened in these rooms. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see one of history's most celebrated civilizations. Because while Rome built roads that still exist today, while they created law systems we still use, while they engineered aqueducts that were marvels of their time, they also developed bathroom practices so bizarre, so unsettling, so completely alien to our modern sensibilities that scholars actually hesitated to discuss them for centuries. This isn't just about toilets. This is about intimacy and shame, about class and power, about what humans are willing to accept as normal when everyone around them accepts it too. Have you ever stopped to think about how the most private moment of your day, that moment when you close the bathroom door and lock it behind you, shapes your entire sense of self? That privacy, that locked door, that solitude you take for granted didn't exist for Romans. Not even for emperors, especially not for emperors. And what they did instead, what they built, what they normalized, reveals something profound and disturbing about human nature itself. Let me tell you about the Forica. That's what Romans called their public toilets. Though the word doesn't quite capture the reality of what these places were. Picture a long room, maybe 30 feet across, sometimes much larger. The walls are decorated with frescoes, sometimes quite beautiful ones. There's a shallow channel running along the base of the walls with constantly flowing water. And then, arranged in a U shape or sometimes lining 3 walls of the room, there are bench-style seats made of marble or limestone, polished smooth by countless bodies. These seats are cut with keyhole-shaped holes, placed so close together that when you sat down, your thigh would touch the thigh of the person next to you. Not occasionally, every single time. There was no privacy, no stalls, no doors, no partitions of any kind. When you used a Roman public toilet, you did so inches away from dozens of strangers, looking them in the face, continuing whatever conversation you'd been having, conducting business deals, discussing philosophy, making jokes. The most intimate biological function humans perform, the one we instinctively hide even from our closest family members, Romans did in crowds, in public, while maintaining eye contact. Can you imagine it? Can you actually picture yourself sitting there, trying to relieve yourself while negotiating a contract with a stranger to your left, and making small talk with the acquaintance to your right? Your modern mind recoils. Your sense of privacy, so deeply ingrained you probably never even think about it, screams in protest. But that discomfort you're feeling right now, that visceral wrongness, Romans didn't feel that. Or at least, they weren't supposed to. They had been socialized from childhood to see this as completely normal, to see privacy in the bathroom as strange, perhaps even suspicious. What are you hiding? Why do you need to be alone? Now here's where it gets stranger. Remember the channel of running water I mentioned, the one flowing along the base of the walls? That wasn't for waste removal. The holes in the benches dropped waste into a deeper channel beneath the seats that flushed it away. No, this shallow channel in front of the seats served a different purpose entirely. Romans didn't have toilet paper. They had something called a tersorium, and understanding this object is crucial to understanding just how different Roman bathroom culture was from anything you know. A tersorium was a wooden stick, about a foot or 2 long, with a natural sea sponge attached to one end. You would use the sponge to clean yourself after defecating. But here's the thing that makes your modern germophobic mind want to shut down completely. These sponges were communal, shared public property. After you used the tersorium, you would rinse it in that shallow channel of running water, then leave it there for the next person. The next person would pick it up, use it on themselves, rinse it, leave it for the person after them. All day long, every day. The same sponges pass from stranger to stranger, intimate body part to intimate body part, with nothing but a quick rinse in between. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. The same sponge that just touched the most private part of the person before you is now about to touch yours. And you know this. Everyone knows this. And it's fine. It's normal. It's just how things are done. The running water was supposed to keep the sponges clean, and maybe by Roman standards, it did. But we know now, with our understanding of bacteria and parasites and disease transmission, what was actually happening every time someone used one of those shared sponges. We'll get to that horror later. But for now, just sit with this reality. Communal but sponges were the standard for the most powerful civilization in the ancient world. Do you think you could do it? Do you think you could adjust if you had to? If you were transported back to ancient Rome tomorrow, if your survival depended on fitting in, could you overcome that screaming internal resistance and pick up the wet sponge that a stranger just used? Could you sit shoulder to shoulder with people you'd never met and carry on casual conversation while your bowels emptied? Or would something fundamental in you break? But we're just getting started, because the public toilets, as disturbing as they were, weren't even the worst of it. Let's talk about what happened in the private homes of Rome's elite. Let's talk about the slaves. Wealthy Romans had private toilets in their homes, of course. They were called latrinae, and they offered slightly more privacy than the public freak, though often not much. Many were located in small rooms off the kitchen or the atrium, sometimes with a door, sometimes without. But the crucial difference wasn't privacy. It was who cleaned them. In a wealthy Roman household, there was a specific category of slave whose job was to maintain the latrinae. They would clean the seats, manage the waste channels, ensure everything flowed properly. But they also served another function, one so degrading that ancient sources mention it only in passing, as if it were too obvious to explain in detail. Some scholars believe, and the evidence, fragmentary as it is, seems to support this, that certain slaves were required to warm the toilet seats for their masters. Let me say that again clearly, because it sounds like the kind of salacious myth that gets spread about ancient civilizations, the kind of thing someone made up to make Romans seem more decadent than they were. But multiple sources, including Seneca and other writers, reference this practice. On cold mornings, before the master or mistress of the house needed to use the latrine, a slave would sit on the cold marble seat until their body heat warmed it. Then, they would vacate immediately before the owner arrived, leaving behind a warm seat, pre-warmed by another human being's buttocks. A human being who had no choice in the matter. A human being whose body heat, whose very flesh, was considered just another household amenity. Can you fathom the mindset required to use such a service? To walk into your bathroom and sit down on a seat still warm from your slave's body, knowing they sat there for the sole purpose of preventing you from experiencing a moment of cold discomfort. The intimacy of it is staggering. The dehumanization is complete. That slave wasn't warming an object for you. They were using their body, the most personal thing a human possesses, as a tool for your fleeting comfort. And this was considered normal, unremarkable, just how things were done in a civilized household. Now imagine being that slave. You wake up before dawn because your master prefers to move his bowels early in the morning. You walk to the latrine, still dark, still cold. You lower yourself onto the marble, feeling it freeze your skin. You sit there, naked flesh on stone, for 10 minutes, 15, 20, however long it takes. Your body rebels against the cold. Your muscles tense. You wait. You hear your master approaching. You stand quickly, not meeting his eyes, and leave the room so he can take your place on the seat you've warmed for him. And tomorrow, you'll do it again. And the day after that, 4 years, decades perhaps, until you're ready to old to be useful and they sell you to someone else or let you die. This is what Rome was. This is what their civilization, their law, their order made possible and normalized. But let's go deeper still, because we haven't yet confronted the single most disturbing element of Roman bathroom culture. We need to talk about what was actually happening in those public toilets, beneath the surface of social normalcy, in the realm of biology and disease. Modern archaeologists and medical historians have done something remarkable. They've excavated ancient Roman toilets. They've analyzed the archaeological remains of Roman sewers. They've examined fossilized feces from Roman sites, using techniques that can identify not just what Romans ate, but what parasites lived in their guts. And what they've found is genuinely horrifying. Roman public toilets were disease factories. You see, the Romans were incredibly proud of their sanitation systems. Their aqueducts brought fresh water into cities. Their sewers, like the famous Cloaca Maxima in Rome itself, carried waste away. They built public baths where people could wash. They genuinely believed they were cleaner, more hygienic, more advanced than the barbarians beyond their borders. And in some ways, they were right. Having running water and waste removal was certainly better than nothing. But here's what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand without microscopes. And germ theory. Their public toilets, their communal baths, their shared sponges were perfect vectors for disease transmission. Recent studies of Roman-era remains have found evidence of parasites that modern researchers didn't expect to find in such abundance. Whipworm, roundworm, and especially a parasite called Trichuris trichura were everywhere in Roman cities, far more prevalent than in Iron Age settlements that existed before Roman sanitation. Think about that. Their advanced sanitation made certain diseases worse, not better. How is that possible? The answer lies in those communal sponges and in the architecture of the toilets themselves. When you have dozens of people in a single room, all defecating into channels that flow into a common sewer, all using the same cleaning sponges, you create what's called a fecal-oral transmission pathway. Parasites and bacteria from one person's waste get onto the sponge. The sponge touches the next person's mucous membranes and skin. Those parasites find a new host. That person's waste contains the parasites. They get onto the sponge, and on, in a cycle that fed itself every single day. But it gets worse, much worse, because Romans didn't just use public toilets for defecation. They used them socially. People would spend hours in the forica, especially in winter when the public baths were closed or too cold. The toilets were warm, kept temperate by the body heat of dozens of people and the constant flow of water that had been heated by passing through the hypocaust heating systems. They became gathering places, social hubs, places where business was conducted, where gossip was shared, where people just hung out. Imagine a parasite's perspective for a moment. You're a microscopic organism that reproduces in human intestines and needs to find new hosts to continue your species. You could rely on random chance, on contaminated food or water. Or you could end up in a Roman public toilet where your host is literally sitting pressed against dozens of potential new hosts, where everyone is using the same cleaning implements, where people are spending hours in warm, moist conditions perfect for your survival. From a parasite's point of view, Roman public toilets were paradise, a perfectly designed system for spreading themselves through an entire population. And the evidence shows that's exactly what happened. Parasitic infection rates in Roman cities were staggeringly high, higher than in medieval cities, higher than in many developing countries today. The very infrastructure Romans were so proud of, the sanitation they thought made them superior to barbarians, was systematically infecting them with parasites. But here's the question that should haunt you. Did they know? Could they tell? Some parasites cause obvious symptoms: diarrhea, cramping, blood and stool, weight loss. But many parasitic infections are chronic and mild. You might have whipworms in your intestines for years and barely notice. You feel tired more often. Your stomach hurts sometimes. You're thinner than you should be. But you felt this way for so long that it just seems normal. Everyone else seems to feel about the same. Your doctor, if you're wealthy enough to have one, might give you some herbs or recommend certain foods. but he certainly doesn't know about intestinal parasites. Nobody does. So you keep going to the public toilets. You keep using the communal sponges. You keep pressing your skin against strangers' skin on those marble benches. And you keep reinfecting yourself over and over for your entire life. This is the hidden cost of Roman bathroom culture. Not just the indignity, not just the disease, but the silent, invisible suffering that nobody could name or understand. Can you imagine living with chronic parasitic infection and not even knowing that's what it was? Not knowing it was preventable. Not knowing that the very things your society told you were civilized and hygienic were making you sick. Now let us talk about something that ancient sources mention, but that archaeologists debated for years. The question of what Romans did when they couldn't get to a toilet in time. In wealthy households, chamber pots were common, called lacinum or scaphium. These were ceramic or bronze pots that people could use privately in their bedrooms at night, or when ill. Slaves would empty them in the morning. But here is what makes this interesting. There is significant evidence that people didn't just use chamber pots in private. There are references in ancient sources to people relieving themselves in the pots. During dinner parties, during long meetings, sometimes just because it was more convenient than walking to the latrine. The poet Martial mentions a man who urinated into a jar while reclining at a feast. Suetonius records that the Emperor Claudius considered issuing an edict, allowing people to pass gas at dinner parties because holding it in was considered unhealthy. These weren't scandals or shocking behaviors. They were just facts of life, mentioned in passing because they were so normal that they barely warranted comment. But what about in public? What did you do if you were walking through the forum and nature called urgently? Archaeological evidence suggests that Romans had public urinals on street corners in busy areas. These were usually just large ceramic jars or stone troughs set into walls. You would urinate into them in full view of everyone passing by. The urine wasn't waste, it was valuable. Fullers, the people who cleaned and bleached cloth, needed large quantities of urine for their work. The ammonia in urine was an effective cleaning agent, so these street urinals served a dual purpose: public convenience and commercial resource. Collection. Slaves employed by fullers would come by regularly to collect the urine and take it to the workshops. The Emperor Vespasian actually taxed the urine collection industry. When his son Titus complained about the unseemliness of taxing urine, Vespasian held up a gold coin and said, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't smell. That phrase has come down to us through history, often quoted in economics and philosophy. But think about what it really means. Think about the fact that an emperor of Rome was defending a tax on collected human urine, and his defense was essentially money is money. But urinating in public jars is one thing. What about defecation? Archaeological excavations have found evidence of feces in alleys, in the corners of buildings, basically anywhere relatively secluded in dense urban areas. Roman cities had laws against this. There were actually fines for defecating in public places, but the frequency with which the laws had to be restated suggests that enforcement was sporadic at best. When you had to go, you had to go. And if you were poor, if you lived in a cramped, insulated apartment building with no private facilities, if the public toilets were far away or too crowded, you did what you had to do. There are even accounts of people emptying chamber pots out of windows in the middle of the night, just tossing the contents into the street below. The satirist Juvenal warned about walking under windows at night because you might get drenched with the contents of someone's chamber pot. He wasn't exaggerating for comic effect. This actually happened regularly enough that it was a recognized hazard of urban life. So we have this strange contradiction at the heart of Roman bathroom culture. On one hand, they built sophisticated public toilets with running water and waste removal. They created laws about public decency. They developed elaborate bathing rituals. They considered themselves civilized, clean, advanced. On the other hand, people routinely urinated in public jars, defecated in alleys, and threw human waste out of windows. The rich warmed their toilet seats with slaves' body heat while the poor squatted in corners. Everyone, rich and poor alike, sat shoulder to shoulder on communal toilets, and shared dirty sponges. How do we make sense of this? How did Romans themselves make sense of it? The answer, I think, lies in understanding what privacy meant to Romans versus what it means to us. For modern people, privacy is fundamental to dignity. We believe that certain activities, sex, bathing, using the toilet should be private precisely because they involve our bodies in vulnerable states. Privacy protects our dignity. It allows us to maintain the social self, the public persona we present to the world, by keeping the animal self, the biological self, hidden away. But Romans didn't think this way. Dignity, for Romans, came from status, from social position, from virtue defined in completely different terms than we use. A Roman aristocrat didn't lose dignity by using a communal toilet, because dignity was located in bodily privacy. It was located in social standing, in connections, in wealth, in public honor. The slave who warmed his toilet seat didn't make the aristocrat less dignified. If anything, having slaves who performed such intimate services demonstrated the aristocrat's high status. Similarly, privacy wasn't valued the way we value it. Romans lived much more communally than we do. Extended families lived together. Slaves were everywhere in wealthy households, privy to every aspect of their owners' lives. Public spaces were where life happened: the forum, the baths, the markets, the toilets. The concept of a private individual with an inner life separate from their public role didn't really exist the way it does for us. But does understanding this cultural difference make it less disturbing? Can you really accept that it was just different? Not wrong when we're talking about humans being used as seat warmers, about disease spreading through communal sponges, about the complete absence of what we consider basic dignity. This is the question you have to ask yourself. Is privacy a fundamental human need? Or is it a cultural construct? Romans lived for 1,000 years without bathroom privacy and seemed fine with it. They didn't consider themselves oppressed or degraded by communal toileting, or at least the sources we have don't record any such complaints. Does that mean privacy isn't actually important? Or does it mean that humans are so adaptable, so capable of normalizing any condition we're born into, that we can't use what people accept as evidence of what they truly need? Let me tell you about an inscription found at the Roman city of Pompeii, preserved by the volcanic eruption that destroyed the city in 79 CE. It was written on the wall of a public latrine: Apollinaris, medicus tedi imperatores, hic cavet bene. Apollinaris, physician to the Emperor Titus, had a good shit here. Think about that. Someone, a physician, a person of some social standing and education, felt moved to write on a bathroom wall, in Latin no less, to commemorate a satisfying bowel movement. This wasn't graffiti by a bored teenager. This was a grown adult, probably middle-aged or older, announcing to anyone who used this toilet in the future that he had been there, and that his experience had been positive. We have hundreds of examples of latrine graffiti from Pompeii and other Roman sites. People wrote poems on bathroom walls. They drew pictures. They left messages for friends. They made jokes. The latrine wasn't just a place to relieve yourself. It was a social space, a public space, a place where you left your mark literally and figuratively. But there's something else in this graffiti. Something darker that appears over and over in different forms. Curses, magical spells, pleas to gods for revenge against enemies. You see, Romans believed that toilets were spiritually dangerous places. They thought that demons and malicious spirits lurked in sewers and could rise up through the toilet holes to cause harm. There was actually a goddess, Clocina, whose job was to protect sewers and toilets. People would pray to her for safe passage through their bathroom experience. But they also used toilets as places to perform dark magic. The logic went like this: toilets are liminal spaces, thresholds between the civilized world above and the filthy underworld below. They're places where boundaries blur between inside and outside the body, between private and public, between clean and unclean. That makes them powerful locations for magic, especially curses. If you wanted to harm someone, you could write their name on a piece of lead or pottery. often with creative spellings or backwards letters to confuse protective spirits, and throw it down a toilet. The curse would descend with the waste into the realm of chthonic powers, who might act on your behalf. Archaeologists have found dozens of these cursed tablets in Roman sewers. They're called depictions, and they're genuinely disturbing to read. People cursed rivals in business, romantic competitors, enemies in lawsuits. They asked for their targets to suffer disease, loss, death, and they deposited these curses in toilets, mingling wishes for others suffering with their own bodily waste. Can you imagine using a toilet knowing that people might be throwing curses into it, knowing that somewhere beneath you, in the flowing sewage, there might be dozens of tablets calling for pain and death? The toilet as a location wasn't just physically dangerous due to disease. It was spiritually perilous, a place where malevolent forces gathered. This adds another layer to understanding Roman bathroom culture. It wasn't just practical and social. It was supernatural. Every time you used a public toilet, you were potentially exposing yourself not just to other people and their germs, but to demons, spirits, and the malicious magic of enemies you might not even know you had. And yet people still gathered there, still spent hours socializing, still treated it as a normal part of daily life. The fear, the danger, both real and imagined, just got absorbed into the background of existence. You learn to live with it. You develop little rituals, maybe a prayer to Clochina before sitting down, a gesture to ward off evil spirits. But mostly, you just accepted it. Because what other choice did you have? Now let's turn our attention to something that almost no popular histories of Rome discuss, but that scholars have spent considerable time investigating: the connection between Roman bathroom practices and sexual exploitation. Public toilets weren't just places for defecation and urination. They were also, according to multiple ancient sources, places where sexual transactions occurred. Prostitutes of the lowest social class, those who couldn't afford even the cheapest rooms in brothels, sometimes worked in or near public latrines. The very word latrina may be etymologically connected to latere, meaning to hide, and some scholars have suggested that this refers not to hiding one's bodily functions but to the clandestine sexual encounters that took place there. Think about this in the context of everything else we know. You have a crowded room, bodies pressed together, strangers in close proximity, the smell of waste, the sound of flowing water, the dim light. Most public toilets didn't have large windows, and at night they would have been lit only by oil lamps. And in these conditions, sexual services were being offered and purchased. The degradation is multi-layered. For the prostitute, this was work at the absolute bottom of an already despised profession. For the client, this was sex at its most sordid and hurried, conducted in a place literally filled with human excrement. And yet it happened, regularly enough that writers mention it, that laws attempted to regulate it, that it became just another feature of these spaces. Martial, Juvenal, and other satirists reference latrine prostitution, usually as shorthand for the depths of depravity. But their very use of it as a rhetorical device tells us it was common enough to be recognizable. When Juvenal wanted to insult someone by suggesting they were desperately poor or morally bankrupt, he might imply they had sexual encounters in latrines. He wouldn't have done this if his audience didn't immediately understand the reference. But there's an even darker element that some sources hint at but don't fully explain. There are references to sexual assault occurring in public toilets. The logic, horrible as it is, makes sense. Crowded spaces with poor lighting, where people are in vulnerable positions, where the victim would be literally caught with their pants down, where escape would be difficult and witnesses might not intervene. We do have many specific accounts of sexual violence against slaves, and lower class people wasn't considered worth recording in detail by Roman historians. But the scattered references we do have paint a grim picture. Public toilets were dangerous spaces for women, for children, for slaves, for anyone without the social power to protect themselves. And this danger existed right alongside the social functions, the business dealings, the casual conversations. People knew these things happened. They just accepted it as part of the risk of using public facilities. How do you psychologically reconcile that? How do you sit in a latrine making small talk with your neighbor, while knowing that in this very room, people have been assaulted? That in the corners dimly lit by oil lamps, someone might be exploiting someone else right now. Do you intervene? Do you pretend not to notice? Do you simply accept that this is how the world works and try not to think about it? The evidence suggests most people chose the last option. They compartmentalized. They focused on their own business, literal and figurative. They maintained the social fictions that made daily life bearable, because the alternative confronting the full reality of what these spaces were would have made them unbearable. Let me tell you about the Great Sewer of Rome, the Cloaca Maxima. It was one of the world's earliest sewer systems. Built according to tradition in the 6th century BCE by the Etruscan king Tarquinius Priscus. It still exists today, still functional after more than 2,500 years. Romans were immensely proud of it. They considered it one of the great engineering achievements of their civilization. Comparable to their roads and aqueducts, the Cloaca Maxima is enormous. At its outlet to the Tiber River, the drain is over 3 meters wide, large enough for a person to walk through upright, large enough, according to some sources, for a wagon loaded with hay to drive through. It collected waste from public toilets, from streets, from everywhere in Rome, and flushed it into the river. But here's what Romans didn't understand. They were contaminating their water supply. The Tiber wasn't just a sewer outlet. It was also a source of water for people living downstream. Fishermen caught fish in the Tiber and sold them in markets. People bathed in it. In times of aqueduct failure, people even drank from it. And the river was full of raw sewage from the Cloaca Maxima and dozens of smaller drains. We know from archaeological evidence that the Tiber was horrifically polluted. Analysis of sediment layers shows massive contamination with fecal bacteria, heavy metals from industrial processes, and all sorts of other waste. Fish from the Tiber would have been swimming in a toxic stew. Anyone who bathed in it would have been exposing themselves to countless pathogens. But Romans saw the Cloaca Maxima as a triumph. It took waste away from the city. It kept the streets cleaner than they would have been otherwise. It solved the immediate, visible problem. The fact that it was creating invisible, downstream problems, disease spreading through contaminated water, environmental degradation, health crises for people who had no idea what was making them sick wasn't apparent. Couldn't have been apparent with the scientific knowledge of the time. This is one of the great tragedies of Roman bathroom culture. They tried. They genuinely attempted to create sanitary conditions. They built infrastructure that was genuinely impressive for its time and that demonstrated sophisticated engineering. They created public health measures that they believed would protect their citizens. And in many ways, these systems did help. Removing visible waste from streets was better than leaving it there. Having designated toilet facilities was better than having everyone defecate wherever they happened to be standing. But their solutions created new problems they couldn't see. The public toilets spread disease through shared sponges. The sewers contaminated water supplies. The very infrastructure they were proud of was making them sick in ways they couldn't detect or understand. They thought they were being clean and civilized, and in some measurable ways they were. But they were also systematically exposing themselves to parasites and pathogens. Can you blame them for this? Should we judge Romans for not knowing about germs and parasites when those concepts wouldn't be discovered for another 1,000+ years? Or do we simply acknowledge the tragedy of it, that they were trying to do the right thing, that they made their best effort with the knowledge they had, and that it wasn't enough? But here's the question that should really trouble you. What are we doing right now in our modern world that we think is clean and safe and civilized that future people will look back on with the same horror we feel toward Roman bathroom practices? What are the invisible costs of our infrastructure, our conveniences, our normal daily practices? What are we exposing ourselves to that we can't detect yet? Now let us discuss something that might initially seem tangential, but is actually central to understanding Roman bathroom culture. The relationship between bathroom practices and social class. We've talked about wealthy Romans having private toilets and slaves to warm them. We've mentioned that poor people living in insulated apartments often had no private facilities. But the reality of class differences in bathroom access was even more stark than these facts suggest. The insulae of Rome multi-story apartment buildings where the working poor lived rarely had any plumbing at all. Water had to be carried up from public fountains. Waste had to be carried down to be dumped in designated areas or, illegally, in alleys. If you lived on the ground floor, maybe you had relatively easy access to the street and could reach a public toilet quickly. But if you lived on the 5th or 6th floor of an insula, and some of these buildings were dangerously tall, getting to a toilet meant descending multiple flights of stairs. Possibly in the dark, possibly in bad weather, possibly when you were sick or elderly or a young child. These military latrines followed the same basic design as civilian public toilets. Long benches with holes, channels for waste removal, flowing water but with some modifications for military life. They were often larger, capable of serving dozens of soldiers at once. They were positioned away from water sources to prevent contamination, though this precaution wasn't always successful, and they were maintained by soldiers on punishment detail, which meant maintenance quality varied wildly depending on how strictly discipline was enforced. But here's what is fascinating. Soldiers seem to have developed their own latrine culture. Distinct from civilian practices, there's evidence that military latrines became sites of male bonding, where soldiers would gather not just for necessity but for camaraderie. They'd sit together, joke, share stories from home, build the social connections that are crucial for unique cohesion. The latrine, as degrading as it might seem, was actually part of the social infrastructure that kept Roman legions functioning as effective fighting forces. Can you imagine using the toilet as a team-building exercise? It seems absurd, but from a military psychology perspective, it makes sense. If you can sit literally butt to butt with your fellow soldiers, if you can be that physically close and vulnerable with them without shame, you're more likely to trust them in battle. You've already shared the most undignified parts of being human with them. Facing the enemy together is just one more thing you'll do side by side. This military latrine culture had another effect. It transmitted Roman bathroom practices. Throughout the empire, soldiers from every corner of Rome's territory served together. They learned to use communal toilets, to accept the absence of privacy, to participate in the social rituals of the latrine. When they completed their service and returned home, or when they retired and settled in new colonies, they brought these practices with them. They expected facilities like the ones they'd used in the legions. They built them if they didn't exist. They taught their children that this was normal. In this way, the military was a vector for cultural transmission, spreading Roman bathroom habits far beyond Rome itself. Communal toilets, flowing water sewers, the whole infrastructure and cultural framework of Roman sanitation spread to Britain, to North Africa, to the Middle East, to the frontiers of Germany. Local populations were integrated into Roman culture, partly through adopting Roman bathroom practices. Think about what that means. Imagine you're a member of a tribe that Rome has recently conquered. Your people have their own bathroom practices, whatever those might be. Maybe you dig individual pits. Maybe you use designated outdoor areas. Whatever you've been doing, it's familiar and private and, in its own way, dignified. And then Romans arrive and build one of their communal latrines. And they expect you to use it. They expect you to abandon your own practices and sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers, with conquerors, with the people who killed your warriors and enslaved your neighbors. They expect you to defecate in public, to use their communal sponges, to accept their way of doing things as superior to yours. Do you do it? Do you resist? What does compliance cost you, psychologically and culturally? What does resistance cost you, practically and politically? We have very little direct evidence about how newly conquered peoples reacted to Roman toilet culture, but we can infer from the fact that Roman-style toilets were built throughout the empire. and seemed to have been used that most people eventually adapted. They accepted it. They taught their children to accept it. Within a generation or two, using Roman toilets was normal, and the old ways were what their grandparents did back before civilization came. This is how colonization works, isn't it? Not just through military force, but through 1,000 small changes to daily life. Through infrastructure that seems like an improvement. In some ways, running water is better than no water, but that costs you something fundamental in terms of autonomy and cultural identity. Through the gradual erosion of your own practices until they seem backward and uncivilized even to you. The bathroom, of all places, becomes a site of cultural conquest. That's worth sitting with for a moment. But there is another aspect of military latrines that is darkly significant. They were sites of extreme vulnerability. A soldier using the latrine was literally caught with his pants down. He couldn't reach his weapons quickly. He couldn't run effectively. If the camp was attacked during latrine time, those soldiers were at serious risk. Roman military manuals acknowledge this. There were rules about when soldiers could use the latrines, about maintaining guard even during toilet time, about the importance of locating latrines where they could be defended, because enemies knew this vulnerability too. There are accounts of attacks timed to coincide with periods when large numbers of soldiers would be using the latrines. The most famous example comes from the Jewish-Roman Wars. Josephus describes an incident where Jewish rebels attacked a Roman camp early in the morning when soldiers were visiting the latrines. The Romans, caught unprepared, suffered significant casualties before they could organize a defense. The latrine, that mundane necessity, became a strategic weakness. And here's the psychological weight of that. Every time a soldier used the latrine, especially in hostile territory, he had to be aware that he was making himself vulnerable, that his body's needs were creating a window of opportunity for his death. You couldn't just relax and relieve yourself. You had to stay alert, keep your weapon within reach, be ready to fight even in the middle of defecating. Can you imagine living with that stress? Day after day, year after year of military service, every trip to the toilet is potentially your last. Every moment of physical necessity is a moment of danger. How does that shape your relationship with your own body, with the basic functions that you can't avoid no matter how much risk they create? Soldiers learn to be quick. They learn to defecate on command, essentially training their bodies to evacuate efficiently during designated safe times. This is actually still part of military culture in many ways. Modern militaries understand that bowel control and efficient toilet use are tactical necessities. But Romans pioneered this understanding. They recognized the bathroom habits had military significance and adapted accordingly. The human body is a tactical problem. That's what military toilet culture reduced it to, and soldiers accepted this. They trained themselves. They overcame their body's natural rhythms and imposed artificial ones. Also, they could shit on schedule and minimize their vulnerability to enemy attack. Now, let me tell you about something that ancient sources are frustratingly vague about, but that we can piece together from archaeological evidence and scattered references. What happened to Roman bathroom practices after the fall of Rome? When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, the infrastructure that supported Roman sanitation collapsed with it. The aqueducts stopped being maintained, the sewers clogged, the public baths closed, and the public toilets, those marble bench communal facilities that had defined Roman bathroom culture for centuries, fell into disrepair and were eventually abandoned. What replaced them? In most places, nothing equivalent. Medieval Europeans didn't build communal toilets. They didn't maintain sophisticated sewerage systems. For centuries, bathroom practices actually regressed from the Roman standard. People used chamber pots, which were emptied into streets or rivers. They used private outhouses, simple pits dug behind houses. They defecated in alleys, in corners, anywhere relatively secluded. Privacy returned, but at the cost of sanitation. Medieval cities were arguably filthier than Roman cities had been, at least in terms of visible waste. The smell of medieval cities is legendary. Human and animal waste was everywhere, without the infrastructure to remove it efficiently, without even the concept that it needed to be removed systematically. Waste just accumulated. Epidemics followed. The Black Death, the plague that killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread partly through the horrifically unsanitary conditions in medieval cities. Rats thrive in the filth. Fleas fed on the rats. Plague bacteria spread through flea bites. Would better sanitation have prevented the plague? Maybe not entirely, but it certainly would have reduced its spread and impact. So here is the question: were medieval Europeans better off with their private chamber pots and dirty streets than Romans had been with their communal toilets and sewers? The medieval approach gave people privacy, but it created conditions for arguably worse disease transmission. The Roman approach prevented some diseases but spread others. There's no clear answer. Both systems had costs and benefits. But what strikes me is how long it took for European civilization to rebuild anything comparable to Roman sanitation infrastructure. Reliable sewer systems didn't return to European cities until the 19th century, more than 1400 years after Rome fell. Communal public toilets began reappearing in the 18th and 19th centuries, as urbanization increased and cities became too crowded for private facilities alone to suffice. And when public toilets did return, they looked very different from Roman ones. They had stalls, not doors, privacy partitions, because European culture had changed. Privacy had become valued in a way Romans never valued it. The idea of sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers while defecating wasn't just unappealing. It was unthinkable, shocking, uncivilized. It's fascinating that this particular Roman practice, among all the Roman cultural elements that influenced later European civilization, was the one that was decisively rejected. Europeans adopted Roman law, Roman architecture, Roman language in the form of Latin. But Roman bathroom culture? Absolutely not. That was seen as barbaric, as proof that Romans, despite all their achievements, were still somehow crude and uncivilized in ways that sophisticated modern Europeans were not. But is that fair? Were Romans actually more barbaric than the medieval Europeans who threw their chamber pots out windows? Or were they just different, with different priorities and values around privacy, dignity, and sanitation? I think this question matters because it cuts to the heart of how we judge other cultures. We look at Roman bathroom practices and feel visceral disgust. But is that disgust based on objective assessment, or is it based on our own cultural conditioning? If you've been raised in Rome, taught from childhood that communal toileting was normal and that desiring privacy was strange, would you feel the same disgust? Or would you feel disgust at the thought of being alone in a bathroom, isolated from community, doing something as universal as defecation without the companionship of your fellow citizens? Let me share one more archaeological finding that puts a strange cap on this entire discussion. In the ruins of Pompeii, in one of the public toilets frozen in time by volcanic ash, archaeologists found the skeleton of a man who died during the eruption. He was sitting on the toilet in the last moments before the pyroclastic surge hit the city, as ash fell and the earth shook. As everyone else was running or hiding or praying, this man was in the public latrine. Maybe he was trapped there, unable to flee. Maybe he was already dead from falling debris. Or maybe, and this is the interpretation some archaeologists favor, he had gone to the toilet during the eruption because even the end of the world couldn't stop him from needing to defecate. There's something profound in that image. A man facing the apocalypse, and his body still demands its due. Nature calls even when Vesuvius does. The most basic human need persisting in the face of catastrophe. But there's also something that reveals the social nature of Roman toilet culture. He died in a public toilet, not a private latrine in his home, if he had one. He went to a communal facility even as the city collapsed around him. Whether by choice or necessity, whether because it was closer or because it was simply where he habitually went, he died in that shared space. And now, 2,000 years later, his skeleton tells us something about Roman bathroom culture that no text could. That even an extremist, Romans used these communal spaces, that the habits and patterns of a lifetime persisted even when everything else was falling apart, that the toilet, mundane and crude as it seems, was so integrated into Roman daily life that it was where someone ended up spending their final moments on earth. What does this tell us? That Rome, for all its glory and achievement, was still fundamentally human. That Romans dealt with the same biological necessities we do. That they built impressive infrastructure to manage those necessities. Infrastructure that both solved problems and created them. That their solutions seem strange and disturbing to us, but were normal and acceptable to them. That culture shapes even our most intimate experiences in ways we rarely stop to consider. Now let's address something that I've been dancing around, something that might be making you uncomfortable. What does it mean that we are spending so much time discussing Roman bathrooms? Why does this matter? Why should you care how people 1,000 years ago dealt with their waste? Here's why. Bathroom practices reveal underlying assumptions about bodies, privacy, dignity, social order, and what it means to be human. Every culture has to solve the same basic problem: humans produce waste. That waste needs to go somewhere. We need facilities and practices to manage it. But how each culture solves the problem tells you an enormous amount about what the culture values and believes. Roman toilet culture tells us that Romans valued social connection over privacy. It tells us that they had different boundaries around bodily functions than we do. It tells us that they were capable of engineering sophisticated infrastructure. But that sophistication doesn't always translate to health or safety. It tells us that they lived with levels of disease and parasitic infection that would be considered catastrophic today, and they just accepted it as normal. It tells us that their class system pervaded even the most intimate aspects of life. And it tells us something about ourselves too. It tells us that our disgust at Roman practices isn't neutral or objective. It's culturally conditioned. We value privacy in bathrooms so deeply that we can barely imagine functioning without it. But that's a learned value, not a universal human constant. Our certainty that we're right and Romans were wrong is based on our cultural perspective, which will seem just as strange and possibly barbaric to people in the future as Roman culture seems to us. Think about the physical layout of modern public bathrooms for a moment. Individual stalls with locks, gaps under and over the doors, but solid partitions between toilets. Sometimes urinals in the open for men, but always with the understanding that you face the wall and maintain distance from others. The entire design is built around minimizing contact, maximizing privacy, preventing anyone from seeing or being seen in the act of bodily elimination. We build this infrastructure because we believe we need it, because exposure during toilet use feels like a violation of dignity. But Romans didn't believe they needed privacy, so they didn't build for it. Their infrastructure reflected their values, just as ours reflects our values. But here asks the uncomfortable question: in what ways might our bathroom practices be creating invisible harms that future people will look back on with horror? Romans thought flowing water and communal facilities were hygienic. They were wrong in ways they couldn't detect. Are we wrong about something similar? Consider toilet paper. We use enormous amounts of it. It's made from trees, requires water and energy to produce, and doesn't biodegrade as easily as we'd like to think. Billions of people flushing billions of sheets of toilet paper every day, creating environmental impacts we're only beginning to understand. Future people might look at our toilet paper used the way we look at Roman communal sponges, as a practice that seemed normal and hygienic at the time, but that caused harm we didn't fully recognize. Or consider water. We defecate into clean, drinkable water, then flush it away, mixing waste with water that took energy to clean and deliver. In a world facing increasing water scarcity, is this sustainable? Is it sane? Or is it a practice that future generations will find horrifyingly wasteful, the way we find Roman practices horrifyingly unhygienic? The point isn't that we should immediately change our bathroom practices, though maybe we should consider it. The point is that studying Roman bathroom culture isn't just archaeology or history. It's a mirror that lets us see ourselves more clearly. It reminds us that our normal is constructed, not natural. That our disgust at other practices is emotional, not objective. That we might be causing harms we can't yet see, just as Romans caused harms they never detected. Let me tell you one final story from the ancient sources, one that captures something essential about Roman bathroom culture and its meaning. Seneca the Younger, the Stoic philosopher, tells a story about a Germanic gladiator who was forced to fight in the arena. The night before his scheduled combat, this man was locked in a cell, probably chained, definitely guarded. There was no chance of escape. He was going to fight the next day, and he was probably going to die. Most gladiators did, eventually. The odds were stacked against him. So this gladiator, facing certain combat and likely death, decided to take control of the one thing he could control, when and how he died. He requested permission to use the latrine. The guards allowed it after all. Even condemned men have bodily needs. They took him to whatever facility was available in the gladiatorial barracks. Probably something very basic, maybe just a bucket or a hole. And there, in that most degraded of spaces, this Germanic warrior killed himself. Seneca doesn't specify the method, but he emphasizes the location, the latrine. The toilet became this man's chosen place of death. He preferred to die there, in his own time and on his own terms, rather than in the arena for Roman entertainment. Seneca tells this story as an example of Stoic principles that a wise man controls what he can control and accepts what he can't, that death is sometimes preferable to dishonor, that the location and manner of death matter less than the mindset with which you face it. But the story resonates on another level entirely. The latrine, that space of degradation and bodily necessity, became a space of ultimate agency and final dignity. The gladiator transformed it from a place of waste to a place of choice, from the most shameful part of existence to the site of his last autonomous act. In choosing to die in the latrine rather than live to die in the arena, he inverted the meaning of both spaces. This is what Roman bathroom culture really reveals, that humans can find or create meaning and dignity in any space, under any conditions. That the physical facts of a place, its smell, its function, its sordidness don't determine its human significance. That we bring meaning to spaces, not the other way around. Romans sat shoulder to shoulder in public toilets and made those spaces work for them. They conducted business there, built friendships there, even found moments of peace or privacy there despite the crowd. That Germanic gladiator found his last moment of freedom there. People left graffiti, marking their existence, claiming some ownership of these degraded spaces. The toilet wasn't just a place of waste. It was a place of humanity in all its complexity. And maybe that's the final lesson, that there is no purely base or degraded aspect of human existence. Even our waste, even our most animal needs, we handle in distinctly human ways. We build infrastructure, develop culture, create meaning. We find ways to preserve dignity even when sitting on communal marble benches with sponges that dozens of strangers have used. We adapt, we normalize, we make even the strangest practices feel normal. Romans lived with bathroom practices that seem grotesque to us. They accepted things we would never accept. They normalized conditions we consider intolerable. But they were still human. Still trying to navigate biological necessity with whatever tools and cultural frameworks they had, still finding ways to be social creatures even in the most antisocial seeming circumstances, still asserting their humanity in whatever ways they could. So when you feel the disgust at Roman toilet culture, when you think about communal sponges and warm toilet seats and no privacy and disease spreading through every shared surface, remember, they probably would have been equally disgusted by aspects of your life, by your isolation in the bathroom, maybe, by your wastefulness with water and paper, by whatever practices we currently think are civilized but that actually cause hidden harms. We're all just humans trying to deal with human problems. Romans solved those problems differently than we do. Not necessarily better. Definitely not worse in every way. Just differently, in ways that reflected their values and knowledge and social structures. And someday, people will look back at our bathroom practices with the same mixture of fascination and horror that we feel toward theirs. The grotesque bathroom habits of ancient Rome aren't really about bathrooms at all. They are about culture and power and privacy and disease and dignity and what it means to be human in a society. They are about how we normalize the conditions we were born into and how hard it is to see our own practices clearly. They're about the gap between infrastructure and understanding, between good intentions and actual outcomes, between what seems civilized and what actually promotes health and well-being. And they're about the fact that 2,000 years from now, people will probably be having similar conversations about us, about our weird, gross, inefficient, harmful practices that we thought were normal, about the diseases we spread without knowing it, about the ways we degraded ourselves and each other without realizing we had better options. The more things change, the more they stay the same. We still produce waste. We still need infrastructure to manage it. We still make cultural choices about privacy and dignity. We still fail to see all the consequences of our decisions. We're still human in all the beautiful and terrible ways that entails. Roman toilets, marble seats in communal rooms, water flowing beneath. Sponges pass from hand to hand. Strangers sitting close enough to touch tell us this truth more clearly than almost anything else from their civilization. Because unlike their triumphal arches and philosophical texts, unlike their carefully curated public image, the bathroom is where we can't help but be honest about who and what we are, and who we are apparently, whether in ancient Rome or the modern world, as creatures capable of adapting to almost anything, of finding meaning in the strangest places, of building impressive civilizations on foundations of practices we don't fully understand. Creatures who will defend our own bathroom culture as civilized while finding others barbaric, never quite realizing that we're making the same mistakes our ancestors made, just in different forms. So the next time you close and lock your bathroom door, enjoying that privacy you take for granted, think for just a moment about the Romans, about what they lost by never having that privacy, about what they gained from their communal toilets that you might be missing, about the parasites they couldn't see but that infected them anyway, about the future people who will study our bathrooms and wonder how we live like that, and then, maybe, feel a little less certain that you have it all figured out. Because nobody ever does. Not the Romans with their impressive aqueducts and dangerous sponges. Not us with our private stalls and wasteful water usage. Not the people who come after us with whatever strange practices they'll develop. We're all just making our best guess at how to manage being animals with aspiration to civilization. Sometimes we get it right, often we don't, but we keep trying, keep building, keep adapting, keep finding ways to preserve some shred of dignity even in the bathroom. That's the real story of Roman toilets. Not that they were gross, though they were. Not that Romans were weird, though by our standards, they were. But that they were human, trying to solve human problems. Succeeding in some ways and failing in others, just like we are. Just like we always have been. Just like we always will be. And somehow, despite everything, despite the diseases, despite the degradation, despite sitting so close to strangers that you felt their body heat, Romans built one of history's greatest civilizations. They endured for 1,000 years. They created art, philosophy, law, engineering that we still admire and emulate. They did all of it while sharing dirty sponges and contracting parasites, and warming toilet seats with slaves' bodies. So maybe the question isn't how could they live like that? Maybe the question is, what could we accomplish if we were half as adaptable as they were? What could we endure if we had to? What could we build despite the obstacles we face? The grotesque bathroom habits of ancient Rome are a challenge to our assumptions, a reminder of human resilience and human blindness, a mirror showing us ourselves through the distorting lens of 2,000 years. And in the end, isn't that what history is for? Not to make us feel superior to the past, but to help us understand the present, not to judge people who came before us, but to prepare for the judgment of those who come after. The Romans who sat in their communal toilets thought they were civilized. They thought they had it figured out. They were proud of their infrastructure and culture, and they were right to be proud. They accomplished remarkable things. But they were also wrong in ways they never suspected, ways that killed them slowly through diseases they couldn't name, ways that we can see clearly now but that they never could. What are we wrong about? What are we proud of that we shouldn't be? What harm are we causing without knowing it? Those are the questions Roman toilets really ask us to consider. And they don't have comfortable answers. But they're worth asking, worth thinking about, worth sitting with, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. Because that discomfort, that squirming feeling when you imagine using a communal sponge or sitting thigh to thigh with strangers, the discomfort is teaching you something about yourself, about your values, about what you take for granted, about the distance between what seems normal and what actually is normal, between what seems disgusting and what we'd adapt to if we had to. Romans adapted. They built a civilization that lasted a millennium on a foundation that included bathroom practices we find intolerable, and someday our descendants will find our practices equally intolerable. We'll wonder how we lived the way we did. We'll feel the same disgust we feel toward Romans. The wheel turns, civilizations rise and fall. Bathroom practices change, but the underlying truth remains. We're all just humans, doing our best with what we know, making choices that seem reasonable at the time, but that might horrify our descendants. The marble benches of Roman toilets are empty now, worn smooth by centuries of weather rather than centuries of use. The water channels have run dry. The communal sponges rotted away 2,000 years ago. But the questions remain. The challenges remain. The gap between what we think we understand and what we actually understand remains. And in that gap, in that space between certainty and reality, the ghost of Rome still has things to teach us, still has truths to reveal, still has grotesque details that, when examined honestly, tell us more about human nature than all the triumphal arches and philosophical treatises combine. Because in the end, we're not what we claim to be. We're what we do when nobody's watching. We're what we accept as normal even when it's strange. We rate how we handle our waste and our bodies and our most animal needs, while trying to maintain the fiction that we raise something more than animals. Romans knew this truth. They lived it every day. They sat in their communal toilets and faced it directly, without the privacy we use to pretend otherwise. Maybe that's why their bathroom practices disturb us so much. Not because they're gross, though they are, but because they're honest, because they reveal the human condition in ways we'd rather not see. But seeing clearly, even when what we see is disturbing, is always worth it. That's what Rome teaches us. From its heights to its depths, from its temples to its toilets, all of it, the glory and the grotesquerie, the marble and the shit, all of it is human, all of it is us.